In today's lesson, we're introducing a group of sounds called stops. And we're starting with the P and B sounds. We're also talking about what your teacher probably didn't tell you. Hi, I'm Josh, your American English guide. So before we get to the P and B sounds, what are stops? Stops are a special group of sounds that are created by stopping the airflow and then pushing it out. So, for example, with the P and B sounds, I am closing my lips and then I am pushing the sound out. P, B. With K and G, we do the same thing in the back of the mouth by closing the tongue. And with T and D, we do the same thing by bringing the tongue up and closing here. Now that's not too difficult. It should be very clear why they're called stop sounds. But there is one really big detail that your English teacher probably did not tell you. For each of these sounds, we actually have 3 different versions. Yes, 3 different versions. So for example, what we will be talking about today are the 3 P sounds and the 3 B sounds. If you remember from previous lessons about consonants, we often look at examples that are at the start of a word, in the middle of a word, and at the end of a word, because sometimes English learners have problems with one or more of those positions. This is especially true of the stop sounds. With other consonants, we just have the same sound in each position. But with the stop sounds, there's a slight little change that can happen depending on where it is in the word and if it's at the start of a stressed syllable or an unstressed syllable. Now that sounds complicated, but I'm going to give you some pretty easy rules that you can follow, and unlike the vowel sounds, this actually isn't that bad. So the thing that we have to understand about stop sounds, especially in English, is that there is an aspirated version, which is just a fancy word meaning that there is a puff of air. We hear the breath. Puh, puh. If it is a voiced sound like B, we won't hear the air, but there will still be more force. B, B. I usually call the aspirated version strong or hard because there's more force. Then there's the unaspirated version of the sound. This simply means that there is not a big puff of air, and there is still a little bit of air, but we don't want to hear any breath. So for P, this would be B, B, compared to P, P. Or with B, it's harder to hear the difference, but the unaspirated B is B, B, compared to B, B. I often call the unaspirated version weak or soft, because there's less force. In addition to aspirated and unaspirated, we have what's called a glottal stop. If you speak a language like German or Japanese, you already know how to do this. We'll talk a little bit more about the specifics when we look at examples, but it's called a glottal stop because there's this part in your throat that opens and closes, like when you swallow. That part is called your glottis, which is a noun. Glottal is an adjective meaning of the glottis. So a glottal stop is actually where you stop the sound by closing your glottis instead of pushing the sound out. For example, with P, if I say stop, I go into the P position, but I don't push the P out, I close here. It is not the same as just not saying the sound. If there's no closing in the throat, it is not a P sound. It does not count. And native speakers will usually be able to hear if you're doing a glottal stop or if you are dropping the sound. So this is very important if you want to sound natural. Let's take a closer look starting with the P sound. First, let's look at the aspirated P. Remember, this means that there's a puff of air that we want to hear after the P. The aspirated P is used at the start of a stressed syllable. For example, pawn, power, pain, appear, apply. So if the aspirated P is used at the start of a stressed syllable, then the unaspirated P is used at the start of an unstressed syllable. For example, apple, happy, super, perceive, polite, parade, perception. Now note that if a P is at the start of a word, even if that syllable is not stressed, it can still come out with some aspiration, and we'll have a little bit of extra air. That's possible, but that aspiration is mainly related to the stress, because a syllable that is stressed needs to be louder and longer, which implies more force. Also notice the second P in perception, which is not at the start of a stressed or unstressed syllable. These will usually simply be weak or soft Ps. Now let's compare the strong P and the weak P in words that contain both. Listen really closely to hear the difference. Pepper, proper, pamper, people, propel, prepare. So notice it's not pepper or pepper, it's pepper. So there's a clear difference in the two types of P's that we're using. Of course, there are times when the letter P is silent. Also note that when you have SP, like speed, spark, spit, many English learners hear more of a B sound, and apparently I hear that quite a few teachers teach it as a B sound. It is not a B sound. It is a soft P. The soft P and the soft B can sound pretty similar. The reason why the P isn't so forceful like speed is because the S is making it softer. S has a very interesting effect on many sounds, but especially when it comes right before one of the stop sounds. We'll learn more about that later. And to finish the P sounds, let's look at some glottal stop examples. Now, it is always possible to enunciate a word like stop and push out a P. It could happen that way. It's not likely. But when you listen to English teachers, we tend to enunciate a little more than the average speaker. And so you might hear from me these sounds being pushed out a little more often. But most of the time we do a glottal stop. And that sounds like this. Stop. Keep. Map. Sip. Up. And you'll notice there's a quick and sharp cut, right? You're cutting the sound, you're stopping the sound. If I don't do a glottal stop and I just drop the sound, but I go into the lip position, stab, keeb, mab. See, because I'm not cutting the voice off, as I close my lips, it starts to sound like an M as the remainder of the sound starts going through my nose. This is because the P, B, and M all share the same position. If you're having trouble making a glottal stop, I have a little trick for you. We're going to borrow some pronunciation from Japanese. Trust me. We're actually going to start with K in the back because it actually gives you a little better feeling for what's happening in the throat. So I want you to do this. First, we're going to say hoka, hoka. That's just one K. We're just saying K. No glottal stop, hoka. Now in Japanese, if you put two of the same consonant, it becomes a glottal stop for stop sounds. So if you see two Ks, it's going to be hokka, hokka. So you see if you just hold your breath for half a second, hok. Now with the P sound, hopa, hopa. Or two Ps, hoppa, hoppa. So you just hold your breath for a second, hop. Now there is one major exception for the glottal stops, which is if a stop were to connect to the next word, like a consonant connecting to a vowel. Stop it. Then this will usually activate the stop and you'll actually pronounce it. Stop it. Stop it. Keep it. Map it. Sip it. Up it. And you can tell that is a soft P. Now let's talk about the B sound. So we're going to follow the same rules. If it is at the start of a stressed syllable, no matter where that syllable is, it is going to be aspirated or more forceful. But because there's voice, we're not going to hear the breath. For example, big, bother, best, about, abandon, debate. Also like the P sound, if it is at the start of an unstressed syllable, or it's just somewhere else in the word that's not at the end, then it will be a soft or a weak B sound. For example, cyber, rubber, hobby, maybe, believe, bacteria, because. Now I couldn't find a lot of words that are good for comparison between these two, but one thing we can look at is the difference between the noun rebel, which has a soft or a weak B, and the verb rebel, which has a strong or a hard B. Rebel, 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 rebel. Note, of course, that there are silent Bs. For example, dumb and debt. Now what about the glottal stop B? So glottal stops work a little bit differently with voiced sounds, the B, G, and D sounds. You do everything the same as the voiceless glottal stops with one big difference. You go into the B position with your lips, you close your glottis as you go into the sound, but you need to make sure that number one, you hold the voice all the way through the close, and that after you close it off, there's this little push out of voice before it's completely closed and you can't push anymore. So let's look at some examples. Lab, cub, robe, herb, noob. Now, of course, if there's a connection, like if we say lab is, then we're going to reactivate this B as a soft B. Lab is, cub is, robe is, herb is, noob is. I want to hear from you. Did your teacher ever tell you that there are 3 different versions of the stop sounds? Thank you so much for watching another English Hacks lesson, and I'll see you in the next one. A very special thanks to our Patreon supporters. Want to see your name here? Check the link in the description.